I'm reading from John chapter 9, verses 1 to 11. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who has sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming, when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was, others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." Well, greetings once again and welcome to this session, the sixth sign in John's Gospel. I've stopped reading at verse 11 because I don't want to take up the whole session with the actual reading. So if you have some time, I encourage you to have a Bible close at hand for when I jump ahead, or to at least go ahead and read it. What is John pointing to with this sign? How does it reveal anything about Jesus? Once again, we need to remember that God is speaking to Jewish people in the language of their own beliefs and symbols, and that they should understand the sign if they're attentive. Let's jump into John's text and seize what emerges. In the opening part of the passage, the disciples ask Jesus a telling question. Who sinned, this man or his parents? It was a common belief that people going through suffering had sinned, or that their forefathers had. They must have sinned. We do this too sometimes. You know, when there is an accident, so often we look for fault and blame. I worked for many years in the emergency services and learnt that accidents happen. Without suggesting that negligence never plays a part, they are called accidents and not on purposes. When someone gets sick, we assume that they ate wrong foods or were reckless in some way. A few months back, despite many precautions and compliance with masking and sanitizing, etc., I contracted COVID-19. It is still a mystery to me where I might have got it. But of interest to me was the number of acquaintances who wanted to know the details. There was a definite sense that some people were judging me for having been careless and for almost deserving to get it. I've even berated myself for having contracted it. It's funny how we are programmed. For the blind man, it was worse. He had lived in the darkness of being blind for all of his life, and as a consequence was never really fully accepted into the worship community of the people of God. His blindness was a blemish, and it meant that he couldn't participate in the way that other citizens could. This was in keeping with the Old Testament. As Leviticus says, "Say to Aaron, for the generations to come, none of your descendants who has a defect may come near to offer the food of his God. No man who has any defect may come near. No man who is blind or lame, disfigured or deformed." That's Leviticus 21, 17 and 18. This had deep social consequences for people like him. We need to understand that faith and public life were one and the same thing in those times. Also, the culture of the day was what is known as a dyadic culture, where one drew one's identity from the larger community or group. There was no such thing as individualism then. Most of you watching will probably be from a Western individualistic cultural worldview. It's worth noting that at least 70% of the cultures in the world today are still dyadic. And in Africa we know what Ubuntu is. This is a dyadic concept where humanity is bestowed by the group identity. What I'm actually saying here is that being blind meant that one was different and really excluded. Jesus' answer to this notion is culturally mind-blowing, but not unprecedented theologically. Jesus says that the man was born blind neither because the parents or the man had sinned, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. The basic sentiment here is in keeping with the book of Job in the Old Testament. Job, we remember, is a righteous and a good man, but ends up losing everything. 3 of his friends take it in turns to chat with him about his suffering, to try and console him, offering the point that Job must have sinned. However, this is all rejected by Job and eventually by God too. Sin is not the cause of all suffering. Jesus agrees with this, but extends it. It is so that God's glory may be revealed. Now, with that out of the way, let's look at the works of God being shown in the blind man. Jesus spits on the ground and makes a paste. He puts it on the man's eyes and tells him to wash it off in the pool of Siloam. It's important to note that the man obeys Jesus. After all, it is a strange way for a healing to be effected. Now, much can be said about this, the whole reading, but within today's time limit, I have to pick and choose. So I do want to focus on the sending to the pool of Siloam. Now, the water in this pool is from a channel that goes through Hezekiah's tunnel that was built during Old Testament times, probably between 700 and 800 BC. It's a marvelous feat of engineering, and it brought life to the city of Jerusalem as they prepared for the siege of the Assyrians under the king Sennacherib. Important for today's sign, though, is that water from the Siloam pool was also used by the priests every year at the Feast of Tabernacles, which would have just recently happened. The water was drawn from the pool and poured out over the great altar as a sign of the pouring out of the Spirit in the last days, or the Messianic days. Jesus sends the man to this place, the source of the water that symbolized the outpouring of God's Spirit. Added to this, it was symbolic of so much more, the Messianic age, and the new thing that God was doing. If you read from Ezekiel 34 onwards, you'll read a lot about that. So what is God saying about the Spirit in the last days? How is the sign pointing to who Jesus is? So moving forward, the man is healed and his sight is restored. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. There is incredulity. People don't believe it. Is this the man? Then there's a forensic investigation again, because when the people had questioned him, they went and called the Pharisees. On a basic level, this sign is a conflict between the Old Covenant and God's New Covenant. The question over who had sinned and the focus of the Pharisees on the fact that the miracle takes place on the Sabbath reveal this. They failed to see the amazing fact that a man who had never seen before can now see. Instead, they get bogged down in their own presuppositions about Jesus and proclaim that he cannot be from God because he'd broken a Sabbath law. They interrogate the parents, who refer them back to the ex-blind man because he is of age. In other words, he has been blind for a long time. Just a quick aside, John tells us that the parents feared the Jewish leaders because they had already decided that anyone who acknowledged Jesus as Messiah would be excluded from the synagogue. This small detail helps us to understand who John's community was. The Greek word for excluded from the synagogue, aposynagogus, is a late word indicating the late date for the writing of John's Gospel. It's very likely that John was addressing Jewish people in his small community who had suffered this fate of exclusion from the synagogue. Think of the blind man's exclusion too. This is significant. John's original listeners would have taken notice. Now I need to rush a bit here, but do want to mention a few things about the second interrogation of the blind man, starting at verse 24. They keep accusing Jesus of being a sinner, but the man replies with the famous words, "All I know is I was blind, but now I see." They then reinforce what I said about the old and the new. You follow him, but we follow Moses. They're unable to cross that tradition line. They don't see what is right in front of them. The easy way out is to go to a default setting and declare, "You have been steeped in sin from birth. How dare you lecture us?" And then an important thing happens. They throw him out. The man excluded at the beginning of the passage for his so-called blemish, and thus being ritually unclean, is now excluded because he is honoring the one who gave his sight to him. In a spectacular turnaround, the blind man sees and begins to see who Jesus is. In this sign, he starts out excluded because he's blind, but now he's excluded because he can see. Without knowing it, it is the leaders that are blind. Thank you again for joining me today. I sincerely hope that it has been useful in unlocking what the signs are pointing to. For next session, please read John chapter 11, 17 to 45. Or if you're really energetic, begin from verse 1. I look forward to catching you next time for our last session. Until then, may God bless you.